In February 1994, Noel and Liam Gallagher and the rest of their Oasis band travelled to Sawmills Studio in Cornwall to re-record their debut album, Definitely Maybe. What eventually became one of the band's biggest albums, in 1994, this was the start of their stellar career. 30 years later, many of the people who worked in the studio during the recordings are still at Sawmills Studios and have all the tales and anecdotes of when Oasis truly became Oasis. Joining me now to walk us through this moment in time is Dennis Smith, owner of Sawmills Studios. Dennis, thank you so much for your time today. We know that, of course, it was a joint effort between you and Ruth and John and whoever else was present in that pivotal moment when Oasis was re-recording Definitely Maybe. But what was your first memory of meeting the band?
My first memory was actually picking them up from the van. On that occasion, it fell to me to take the boat up, pick the boys up from the van. They'd obviously just come from a long journey. Can't remember if they'd come straight off a boat from Holland or whether they come down from Manchester. But anyway, long drive. And when they realised who it was, stood there waiting to meet them, was the person who's going to take them to the studio. I introduced myself. The first person out of the van I recall was Liam. And he was walking, striding towards me, literally straight out of the van, probably glad to be off that journey. And then the rest of the guys. And then we proceeded to load the gear, all the back line and their luggage and stuff, into the boat and take down river. You must understand, our access is unique. You can get there by road or you can walk, but you can't drive a truck or a van or a car up to the doorways into the studio. So that's how it happened.
Did they have that immediate swagger that they still have, Dennis?
Oh, I think Liam's always from even those days, there was a presence, there was a confidence, shall we say. Not an arrogance, just a confidence.
What was the atmosphere like in the studio watching Oasis record what would be their debut album?
Well, I mean, obviously they'd made the record already, or so they'd thought. And then management and label questioned the feel of the whole thing. I think technically it sounded fine, and we can now hear that, obviously, in Noel's mixes finally of those sessions. But it was probably a little safe and polite and clearly not what the label and management were expecting. And I think to some degree, the band too. So this was a second opportunity to make the album in its entirety. And that's what they came down to do. And that was clearly the forefront in their minds. Get this job done.
Was it
businesslike in many respects? It was their second experience of a professional recording studio, and they'd obviously been routining and playing the songs a lot in the time between the first session and our session.
Was it a fun vibe, Dennis? Were there any funny anecdotes of the brothers you can share with us? Any fighting moments or moments that you just loved to have stuck in your mind for the last 30 years?
Well, I would say over the years and the different artists we've worked with, some become high profile, some potter along and some disappear. Some never actually get their records released. But over the years, we've always been very discreet about telling tales. And I think the artists prefer that and feel more secure in the knowledge that we ain't going to go and tell tales. Having said that, there are humorous incidents where nobody minds discussing them and they're a bit of fun. With Oasis, shortly after they arrived, they were, I think it was Liam, Creation sent down a test pressing or an advanced copy of their first single, Supersonic, I recall. And obviously Liam opened it, played it, and then he said to Ruth, Ruth, come and listen to this. This is our first single. We're going to be massive. I think those are probably the exact words. Ruth always tells me that's what was said. And she heard it. And because when we get a new band in, whether it's their first, if it's their debut album or it's some way down the line, they'll all have their visions of where it's going. And I think it's fair to say that when he said we're going to be massive, he had full confidence. Not always what happens, but certainly did with Oasis.
What a nice feeling to have, Dennis, knowing that you knew this band was going to be big as they were recording a debut album. We know that they'd recorded it before, but You know, not every band has that instant success or that kind of, I don't know, je ne sais quoi, you can say, to have a production looking at these boys thinking, oh my God, they're going to make it. But you mentioned Supersonic. When you're listening to the music as it was being recorded, did you have a favorite song in the moment or one that you knew would be a hit?
Well, I think it's fair to say that I wasn't there throughout the whole session.
Mm.
Obviously, Ruth, studio manager, and also at that time cooking and taking care of everybody and doing whatever is necessary in terms of supplies, getting out shopping, one thing another, and on the other side, doing all the paperwork and running the business pretty much. So she was an essential member of the team, and she was there for well over 20 years. Really, we would hear various bits and pieces, and John obviously was in and out. But basically, we never heard the full final theme because certain overdubs were made later, but most of it recorded there. It was mostly taking bits away from the mix than adding to it, I think, because obviously Noel was the first one up quite often, and he'd come down and whack a load of guitar parts over the tops of things and trying things out. And then they were left there for future decision on whether they'd be included in the mix or not. So that's when we would hear a rough monitor mix of things as they were going along. But it always sounded like an interesting session. But it's so early in the day, and you just, because it's one of the numerous bands that come through the door, and certainly at that time, it was a whirlwind. There were so many acts coming through, and a lot of them doing debut albums. And of course, you hope they were going to do well, and you make them feel as comfortable as you could. But at the end of the day, they and the producer were going to be the ones that, and the engineer, of course, that were going to make it happen.
Absolutely. Well, Dennis, you mentioned that they're all staying there because you mentioned this before, but it's a incredibly idyllic spot that you guys have got in Cornwall, and it's isolated. You get there through boat or road, as you mentioned. What did Oasis find so special about really honing in this beautiful recording studio where you're kind of left to feel like a family because you're in each other's space for so long?
Well, it's kind of a home for many people. They often say that. And yes, it is isolated. And basically for a pretty good reason, really. The distractions are less and they can get on with what they want to do. Some artists would send to speak, treat it as a bit of a holiday and go off and have a look round the pleasure domes of Cornwall. But basically, they mostly knew they needed to be there. And the producer would attempt to keep them in line. And with Oasis, I don't recall on that first time. They did come back some years later and do some other things. But basically at that time, I seem to remember they were very focused and it was all just get on with it. But the atmosphere, the atmosphere is unique in the respect of location. And we celebrate it, obviously, because we do stand out a little from the crowd,
Yeah.
which is always a good thing.
Well, Dennis, 10 million people wanting those tickets to Oasis for their comeback tour a few months ago, and there's so many people that missed out. I think 1 million people got tickets for 10 million people trying to get them. How does that make you feel to have been at the front and centre, front row seat to where the magic was made?
Well, first thought is, my goodness, what you do 30 years back and look where it is now. I suppose we're all very proud in our own quiet ways about what happened there and to have been involved with it. No doubt of that. As for the rest of it, well, we're just in the queue.
Just finally, Dennis, when Liam sung at the boxing the other week, he sung classics like Cigarettes and Alcohol, Rock and Roll Star. Did you enjoy the performance or did you delve into that criticism that he received over whether or not his talents had stood the test of time?
Well, I didn't see it live and I didn't see it on a quality monitor or audio, but what I could hear was the band will seem to me to be bang on it. And as for the criticism of his vocals, I can't say that I heard anything to worry about, other than the fact that I suspect he had problem with his in-ear monitors. They were only doing 3 tracks. Don't know how much detail they had at front of house during a sound check. You just don't know these things. The main reason everybody was there, of course, was for the fight. My feeling is that criticisms that have come through, look, you had 96,000 people in that auditorium. How many of them there from Oasis for Liam, and how many were there for the boxing? Well, I think, you can reckon there was going to be a majority there for the boxing. I don't know how many people.
You never know, Dennis. He still has it. Well, I know I said final question, but Dennis, did you get tickets to any of the shows?
I haven't tried yet.
Oh, well, they might invite you back.
Let the dust settle. Let the dust settle. I'm sure we can call somebody and get it sorted, but that they're not doing it till next year. So no, we haven't even tried. No,
I'm sure you've got all the ins in the world after being present for that first, definitely maybe album that everyone is still so obsessed with to this day.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would like to just add something to these comments that have been received, people slagging off Liam. I think human nature being what it is, and filled with disappointment, as most people will have been because they were there to see Joshua win. I think they were sort of feeling very negative and down about that, and it could well be human nature being what it is, that they were going to feel down and rubbish everything, and I think that's quite possibly a lot of where those comments were coming from.
Everyone's a critic, Dennis, but they're all going to be they're still going to be lining up for those tickets next summer. Dennis Smith, owner of Sawmills Studios, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.